The next presentation is by Margarett.
Professor Patnaik, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I also acknowledge the custodians of this land. Yesterday, we spoke to you at a macro level. Today, I'm speaking with you at a micro level on the issue of ethics clearance for new knowledge systems. And in this presentation, I explore the issues of ethics clearance for new knowledge systems in relation to the importance of ethics in research and explain how and why ethics applications are an integral part of the process of consent for any research that is undertaken with any individual. I go on to explain what our country follows, and this is the National Ethics Application Form, which I will refer to as NEAF, and the guidelines for ethical research in Australian Indigenous Studies as produced by the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies, and I will refer to it as the IATSIS guidelines. This presentation articulates the melding of a cultural ethics application as put forward by IATSIS with the national ethical guidelines and the anomalies that occur. I also present this paper in an experiential voice, one that has arisen out of mentoring Aboriginal research students to bring new knowledge systems to the academy. The objective is an exploratory one to generate discussion as to how best to align new research with systems that are already in place. My intent, therefore, is to explore how ethics guidelines can be molded to provide a relevance to the way research needs to be conducted with Aboriginal communities. In this way, again, as an educational practitioner, I bring it to the grassroots level, and I show how to bring new knowledge systems into the academy for further scholarship without compromising that knowledge or the rights of Aboriginal communities in Australia. Now, in relation to that, I just would like to say that I'm an academic working at Deakin University, and my focus is to provide research and research support to Aboriginal research students. And we've already presented that paper in the form of a community-based model, so I won't go into that. But the focus of my work is looking at research in a generic sense and then aligning or melding, I'm still working out the vocabulary here, to the requirements of particular groups and communities. Thus, what follows is an auto-ethnographical, experiential purview of anecdotes and examples of how I work with students in establishing what I term a knowledge platform to facilitate and extend learning and scholarship. My knowledge platform is the focus of another paper, so I won't dwell too much on it here. But what I'm trying to emphasize is that I am in the middle position where I have two very dedicated objectives. One is to bring in the knowledge of the university and to bring in the knowledge of our Aboriginal research students and to present it in the best way possible so that no knowledge is lost. That knowledge is projected to the rest of the world in a way that meets guidelines. So, in exploring new knowledge systems, a factor that I recognize is that a group of students that I teach come from varied backgrounds. Up to this point, there has been no student who has come straight from academic learning in the traditional sense of going through an undergraduate degree to honors and then to postgraduate and then to a research degree. What I do have is a group of students comprising elders, the leaders of a community, Aboriginal education and project leaders working for their communities, and teachers in primary and secondary schools teaching curriculum and development. All these students are Aboriginal. With all due respect, my students do not have the research terminology in the sense of a Western model of explanation, but what they do have is a wealth of cultural teaching and knowledge that is not known to the world. This is where they wish to learn, our students wish to learn the know-how of making that original contribution. And that's the point I made earlier of aligning and melding to ethical documents where possible. However, it's important at the outset, and I've always kept that at the forefront, is to understand not to compromise any knowledge that our Aboriginal students bring with a generic, standardized ethics application. Can we move on, Neeraj, to the third slide? So, a strategy that I adopt is to take students to the first level of my knowledge platform where I deconstruct the conceptualization of what is ethics. Just before this. So what then is ethics? Very generally, ethics is a differentiating between what is right and what is wrong. Of course, there can be so many definitions of what is right and what is wrong. But at the first level, we differentiate what's right and wrong. For research students, it's the type of conduct we need to adopt in various disciplines of study. In a more focused sense, it is the perspective that we follow through in a particular theoretical framework, and to determine how to act. Leading from that, it is the methods that we adopt in determining how to proceed and analyze issues and problems. I put the word problems in inverted commas because I find that my students, my Aboriginal students, find this term problematic. And it is from here on that I narrate to you various anecdotes and various experiences that I have come from with my students. They are often in a dilemma as to how to answer a question like, what is a problem statement? The point that they would like to clarify first with me is, in whose eyes is it a problem? This is an element that is often overlooked in ethics applications. There are two trajectories, consequently, leading from this. One is that ethics promotes the aims of research, which is to contribute to new knowledge, trust, and equity and fairness for all. The other is to ensure accountability. And ethics thus acts as a deterrent for various issues of policy, misuse, conflicts of interest, abuse of human subjects, as I will explain later on. The next level of my knowledge platform is to fulfill the requirements of ethical standards benchmarks. And I discuss this under issues and anomalies in relation to ethical standards. So ethical standards benchmark and complexity. And in a while, I'll just show you a map, again, our map to illustrate what I mean. At Deakin University, for Aboriginal students, before conducting research on any individual or group, a researcher needs to purview the guidelines for ethical research, the IFC guideline for Indigenous studies, and then submit an application in the national guidelines, that is underneath. I draw attention to the word national, which stipulates its use for the whole of Australia as designed to enable researchers in all disciplines to complete ethics proposals and for submission to the Human Research Ethics Committee. The NEEF application, our NEEF application, has 11 sections made up of 32 pages. The 11 sections consist of proposal description, administrative section, next slide please, participants, resources, project, confidentiality and privacy. Then we have the guidelines for ethical research into Australian Aboriginal studies, the IFC guidelines. This guideline consists of 14 principles, grouped under the broad categories of rights, respect and recognition, negotiation, consultation, agreement, mutual understanding, participation, collaboration, partnership, benefit, outcomes, and giving back, managing research, use, storage and access, and reporting and compliance. Now, these two guidelines must be adhered to in all respects. A student is required to fulfill the NEEF guidelines as well as the IFC guidelines. These procedures are considered the benchmark for research. Whilst thorough, the guidelines are very often incongruent with the guidelines necessary for pragmatic, socio-cultural, political, and ethical guidelines necessary for research into Aboriginal communities and new knowledge systems in Australia. So, for any researcher, filling in a NEEF application is a laborious process. For a novice researcher, this is a daunting task. For a novice and inexperienced researcher who has to align, these are my Aboriginal students, align the necessary requirements, this task becomes overwhelmingly difficult in all the cases. It takes approximately 40 hours to complete an ethics application. In relation to that, another factor that has come up is profiling and diversity. The question of profiling and diversity of Australian Aboriginal cultures is, to say the least, profound. And this is where I'd like the map, please. Yeah. Thank you, Jenny. Okay, this is a map of cultural Australia. Cultural in this sense meaning the Aboriginal cultural communities. Coinciding with this is the map on the slide where we have the Western map alongside the cultural map. Australia has approximately 500 different clan groups, or what is referred to as nations, around the continent. Each has distinctive cultures, beliefs, and languages. Principles 1 to 5 of the ethical guidelines into Aboriginal communities refers to the adherence of rights, respect, and recognition. More specifically, this means that the rights of Indigenous peoples to their intangible heritage must be recognized. As this map indicates, each community has its own system comprising cultures, norms, and values, each with its particular rules. And I'll go into the rules in a minute. Now, filling in a standardized NEEF form, that is the national form, raises issues of cultural insensitivity for all our Aboriginal communities. It also brings up the issues of the dangers of generalizing and understandings and then classifying it as belonging to one Indigenous community across Australia. A comment from a student that becomes very relevant for me is, the way I fill in the ethics, the national ethics form, is not the way my community thinks. And each community is distinct. Now, just in relation to that, if you look at the boundaries on the cultural maps, each community is referred to as a nation in its own right. It is a nation. It is not part of Australia in an Aboriginal cultural sense. Aligned to that is the other map, which refers to all Aboriginal communities as being one. Thank you, Jenny and Estelle. Leading from profiling and diversity is the dilemma students face. Thank you very much. In relation to linguistic and pragma-linguistic failures that occur if students follow to the letter what is given as feedback in standardized NEEF forms. I myself am in a dilemma sometimes as to how to explain this, especially when feedback comes back from assessors asking the supervisor to check the student's work and correct expression with the implicit meaning that perhaps the supervisor does not know. And let me explain this with a few examples. The uniqueness and diversity of Aboriginal communities in Australia is defined by the fact that cultural communities are referred to as nations. Each cultural community is a nation. I use the term cultural communities in a general sense, in that each community is an entity in its own right. They all form part of the continent of Australia in a Western definition. So if students talk about nations as part of their NEEF applications, there are concerns about wrong terms being used historically, when in essence they are the right terms. To bring this into perspective, as a rule, the individuals that live in all the nations referred to are referred to as peoples with an S rather than people. So in effect, the use of the double plural peoples carries a special pragma-linguistic meaning depicting the right term, but in the national assessment of ethics, the wrong grammar. Another one is that the term given to the land mass of the various boundaries is referred to as country. This is without the use of the word of the article the. So when cultural communities talk about their nations, they refer to it as country, simply country, an entity in itself, not the country. And these examples, again, are taken inappropriately by assessors when they are very correct and very appropriate. I need to just mention one more example before I move on to shared knowledge. Am I okay for time? Yes? A student was asked to provide flyers to advertise their research study to an Aboriginal community in which oral tradition and engaging in speech acts to facilitate communication was paramount. The student said to me, how can I give flyers, written flyers, to an oral community? I'm going to be ostracized. Further to this, it would be considered highly insulting to that community where people cannot read or write in a Western coded sense. So in that instance, the student had to write and provide attachments, other documents, to explain to assessors that it was not the student who was at fault. Now, very quickly, in a few minutes, in about 1 minute, there are other principles that are looked at. Shared knowledge. Who shares the knowledge that a student researches? What is the protocol for researching? And in shared knowledge, where students identify their participants, how do they then de-identify them in a national sense? So, the conclusion that has come to me so far is that while an ethics application is integral to research in protecting all communities, there are issues at stake here. And in saying that this was an experiential, autoethnographical, and it was an exploratory study, we are seeking ways in how to mold ethics applications to our various Aboriginal communities. So the question that I'll leave you with is, are ethics applications structured to obstruct research? Thank you.